Well, what's going on, people? My name is Batman, and today we're going to talk about Battlefield Hardline, baby, and whether or not it's the right game for you. Now, as many of you may recall, at the conclusion of the first Hardline beta about 6 months ago, I was not very impressed, mainly because I felt the same way many others did, that the game didn't really offer anything that Battlefield 3 or Battlefield 4 had not already offered. And in fact, it felt a lot like Battlefield 4 without all the cool vehicles and much less destruction. But this most recent beta has done a much better job of establishing Hardline as its own title, and I'll say this. There are much bigger differences between Hardline and Battlefield 4 than there were between Battlefield 3 and Battlefield 4. And in that context, I see it much more favorably. But I think there's a specific type of Battlefield player this game is meant for, and I think there's also a specific type of Battlefield player that will prefer Battlefield 4 and stay on Battlefield 4 for another 8 months or so until Star Wars Battlefront drops. And I suspect Battlefield 4 will continue to receive, support, updates, and maybe even a degree of new content after Hardline is out. For instance, as we speak, they're working on, a nighttime version of Siege of Shanghai, which is currently in the CTE. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw like more, nighttime variants of maps come into Battlefield 4 even after Hardline was out. And I think that was their intention, was to sort of support Battlefield 4 but also bring out Hardline for people who maybe want something new and different. The trick is figuring out which type of player you are. But before we can dive into that, we have to go over what this game's biggest mistake was. It shot itself in the foot, and it's important you understand this mistake before you can decide if the game is for you or not. This game's marketing was done poorly. This game took itself way too seriously. It advertised itself in the same badass tone and gritty themes that we saw with Battlefield 4, when it should have positioned itself, culturally, as something in between Bad Company and Saints Row or Grand Theft Auto, right? Remember, Bad Company had a sort of lighthearted tone, they tried to inject comedy into the formula, and it went over well. You watch a Grand Theft Auto trailer, the trailer is usually funny, it's lighthearted and comedic in tone, typically a parody of the absurdity of American culture. It reflects the absurdity of the game. It owns its absurdity. It doesn't try to run away from its absurdity. But Battlefield Hardline's trailers never tried to be funny or lighthearted. They put on that same badass machismo front we saw with Battlefield 4. There was zero comedy. And I don't think that marketing theme has resonated with most Battlefield players because everyone inherently recognizes the sort of silliness of the game setting. And the premise of Hardline is absurd, period. I'll be playing as a cop, and my guy will tell this robber to put his hands up over his head as I'm drilling bullets into his fucking skull. You have robbers robbing this bank trying to make off with a duffel bag of cash, and in the process they're sacrificing hundreds of lives and losing all the expensive ass guns and equipment that each dead robber was carrying, expensive sports cars and whatnot. I guarantee you those sports cars are worth more than whatever amount of cash they could fit into that duffel bag. Not to mention there are $100 bills falling out of the duffel bag every time they move at all with it on their back. There's no way they're turning a profit on that bank job. And in real life, these robbers would not be classified as robbers, but terrorists. You have cops interrogating robbers with baseball bats and then fucking killing them when the interrogation is over without even reading them their Miranda rights. And a bunch of robbers have stolen cars, and you can't have criminals making off with people's personal property, which is why the cops have to go stop the robbers from stealing cars. But the cops' response to that situation is to destroy the cars and everyone inside them with extremely lethal methods like grenade launchers, heavy machine guns. When a criminal gets killed, it says suspect down, which begs the question, why is the guy getting mowed down by LMG fire on the spot if he's only suspected of something? None of it makes any sense. It's absurd. And the developers tried to own the absurdity of the game. I think they knew it was kind of a silly setting. You got the Easter egg reload animations where you have like a 1 out of 10,000 chance of some neat shit happening. You got like the spotting Easter egg where you flip the guy off. You got the guy using like kinetic force powers from Dead Space to put the clip in. You got a third arm coming out of your neck to put a clip in. It's a silly game, and it seems to have been intended that way. It's just that Bob in marketing is a dumbass. They should have tried harder to own that silliness in the trailers. They should have advertised this game with a more comedic, not giving a fuck attitude. And I really think that had they done that, the Cops and Robbers theme would have gone over a lot better with a lot more people. Because that's one of the main complaints that you hear from a lot of people, is that they think the Cops and Robbers theme is stupid, that it doesn't make sense. I mean, that's how it is in GTA, that's how it is in Saints Row, that's kind of how it was in Bad Company. The difference is those games owned their silliness. But Hardline tried to, advertise itself all badass. It would have been like if Monty Python's Quest for the Holy Grail had like a Lord of the Rings style trailer. Or if they tried to advertise like 22 Jump Street as if it were The Matrix. You know what I mean? It just wouldn't make sense. You'd be like, that seems kind of silly and awkward. And so if you're someone who has sort of been turned off by the entire theme, it seems sort of silly, or I've heard a lot of people say it seems like it's for little kids who lack any basic understanding of how law enforcement actually goes down, my advice would be to go into this game adopting the same kind of mentality you would for a GTA game. Or like I said, a mindset somewhere in between the lighthearted comedy of Bad Company and the pure insanity of Saints Row. Because it's a little more absurd than Bad Company, it's a lot less absurd than Saints Row. You know what I mean? GTA and Saints Row pulled off their absurd silliness because they owned it. And I don't mind a silly game, because silliness is oftentimes a great way to set the stage for a lot of fun, like in GTA when you smoke some marijuana and hallucinate and fight aliens. Absurdity can be fun. And Hardline silliness does allow it the opportunity to provide fun, innovative scenarios that we haven't seen in Battlefield before. Scenarios that would not be plausible outside the cops and robbers setting. I mean, it brought 5 new game modes into Battlefield, which is the first time Battlefield's had genuinely new game modes. I know Battlefield 4 brought some new game modes, but all they did was, like copy Call of Duty Search and Destroy and Domination and TDM, for instance. This is the first time we've seen genuinely new game modes in Battlefield. Game modes that haven't really been done in any way in any other FPS, which I think is a big plus, right? I'm always talking about how I want something new and innovative. And these new game modes are a lot of fun. At the end of the day, gaming comes down to the enjoyment that you derive out of a particular experience. I have derived an immense amount of enjoyment measured in excitement and laughs and thrill and accomplishment in these new game modes, and the rationalization of these game modes are only made possible by that cops and robbers theme, even as absurd as it is. And I'll be straight up, tasering people is a fucking win. And if they had marketed Hardline in a more lighthearted way with more jokes and comedy in their trailers, I really think they would have been able to better communicate that this game is different from Battlefield 4, that it is new, but they marketed it in the exact same tone and demeanor as Battlefield 4, which made it easier for people to assume it was nothing but a Battlefield 4 mod. Especially because the original beta did not really provide a good example of what this game had done differently. It just had that one new game mode. And I was one of those people who was heavily critical of this game. There are a lot of people critical of this game. Nobody was more critical of this game based on that original beta than I was. But they have made significant changes to the game since that beta, and we're seeing a lot more of what the game has to offer that it didn't demonstrate in that last beta. Hardline does have an experience to offer that past Battlefields that any past FPS really have not offered before. Hardline does make a point of doing something new. Now that's not to say everyone is going to prefer the new type of experience Hardline is offering. And certainly Battlefield 4 still offers its own experience that cannot be found in Hardline. But at the end of the day, Hardline does have meaningful innovation, and that's something we have not seen with any FPS title in a long while. That Halo 5 beta was the definition of generic. I played it on 2 occasions, and I did not feel there was anything very memorable about it. I ran around in circles and shot at people and got shot at, and that's what every major FPS has essentially been watered down to at this point, because they are obsessed with simplification for the masses. They are so obsessed with managing people's in-game success against other people, trying to prevent people from doing too good so others don't do too poorly, that they have forgotten entirely about offering new experiences, because new experiences create skill gaps and learning curves and whatnot. Every major FPS has boiled down to running in circles around a map and shooting at people and getting shot at. You look at COD, you look at Destiny, you look at that Halo 5 beta, Halo 4. The majority of the experience in each of those games is exactly the same, with a few minor differences in your character's abilities and the guns you use. Because at the end of the day, it's always the same shit. You run around maps of various sizes, basically aimlessly unless you've memorized the spawns, and you're shooting at people and they shoot back and someone wins and someone loses, and then you respawn and do that a few thousand times and move on to the next sequel. I'm genuinely shocked at how painfully generic the FPS genre has become. Running around maps, shooting people, getting shot at. Now, I've said it before and I'll say it again, I love Battlefield 4 and Battlefield 3 before it, specifically because they did not suffer from this same type of generic bullshit. The experience of those games, though admittedly very similar to one another, was unique and interesting. It was laced in the vehicles, the interactive indestructible maps, the fascinating gadgets and equipment, and different kinds of weapons. They offered an experience that was different and fun. And the reason I was initially skeptical of Hardline is because based on what we saw with that original beta, I was scared shitless that Hardline was going to be the game that genericized the franchise. Bet you didn't realize genericized was a word, but it is, motherfucker. That Battlefield had finally caved and was going to do exactly what every other FPS franchise had done. They were going to take out destruction. They were going to take out most of the vehicles and put in Second Chance and sell a Call of Duty Battlefield where you ran around in circles and shot people endlessly just like you do in every other FPS game. with some slight variations in the guns and the equipment that your character had. But I realize now I was wrong. That's not something you'll hear me say often. In fact, I would argue the only reason I was wrong was because they failed to accurately demonstrate this game's strengths in that original beta, and that's on Bob in marketing, assuming he's the motherfucker who decides what to show off in the demos. Excuse me, I mean the betas. And really, a lot of the stuff in the previous beta that really pissed me off has been adjusted in a way since then that earns my approval, like Second Chance, right? That self-revive EpiPen thing. They nerfed the shit out of it, so it only applies now from explosions and vehicular manslaughter, which means nobody has to worry about running some motherfucker through with a shotgun and then having his zombie ass rise from the dead and taser you. That was something I was very concerned about. That's something they've fixed. I give credit to Visceral for not only communicating with the community, but working their feedback into the game. You look at a studio like Bungie, they put on a good show of listening to people's feedback, but rarely does that feedback affect the actual game. And in fact, a lot of the biggest updates to Destiny have gone through despite mass objection by the community. But my opinion has changed regarding Battlefield Hardline based on more than just the nerf to Second Chance. It's also because I now see what type of experience Hardline is offering. Whereas before I just felt like it was a watered down, simplified for the masses version of Battlefield 4. And I'm beginning to understand why in order to provide that new experience they had to abandon some of the experiences that made Battlefield 4 so great. And obviously the biggest change we're talking about here is Visceral's decision to forego tanks of any kind and heavily armored vehicles in general, which is a significant departure from every Battlefield in the past. Now this decision has upset many longtime Battlefield fans, which I understand. Their basic complaint is how can it be Battlefield without tanks, without the Apache attack chopper, without LAVs and Amtraks and Abrams, because those vehicles and the super intense, dynamic, exciting vehicular warfare they have provided is really the signature characteristic of past Battlefields. It's what has really separated it from other games. It's the experience that Battlefield had that no other FPS could match. It was what defined Battlefield. But this is the point I want to make. Had they kept all that heavy armor in this game, those vehicles and the game design necessary to accommodate them would have put Visceral in a box as far as innovation goes. Then they really would not have been able to do anything different. This would be Battlefield 3, re-released for the second time. It would be the same as Battlefield 4 and 3 before it. Now there will come a time when Battlefield no longer has to nerf itself to run on the old gen consoles, when it can legitimately design itself around the advantages of the new gen consoles, and then it will have Battlefield 5 with heavily armored vehicles, and it will be Battlefield 4 on steroids. It will be a super enhanced version of the experience we've had with Battlefield 3 and Battlefield 4, and thus be a new experience in its own right. But that time is not now. Hardline will be on the old gen, and keep in mind, in less than a year, Star Wars Battlefront is going to release, and what I'm fully expecting, and in fact hoping for, is basically just a Star Wars reskin of Battlefield 4, and the AT-ATs and ATSTs are confirmed to be in the game. We've seen model builds in the behind the scenes dev video they showed at E3, which means it will certainly have all that heavily armored vehicle warfare you're looking for, which would make a re-release of the Battlefield 3 experience, sandwiched in between Battlefield 4 and Star Wars Battlefront, pretty redundant. But in the meantime, what Hardline accomplishes by foregoing the heavily armored vehicles is a game where the vehicular and infantry based combat, for the first time in Battlefield, are meshed together. That's not something that past Battlefields have been able to do before, and what I mean is, if you look at past Battlefields, there are almost always two separate battles going on in any given match. There's the infantry battle and the vehicular battle, and these two fights are for the most part isolated from one another. And there are only 2 times these fights actually intertwine. So say your team has destroyed all the enemy's tanks and your team still has 2 tanks left over, now those tanks are essentially free to shit on the enemy infantry. And the majority of the enemy infantry are left with no option but to run and hide, to concede ground and abandon their posts and flags, because most class builds aren't able to damage enemy armor in any significant way. And so if there was an infantry battle taking place around a flag, it stops as soon as the heavy armor gets involved, because the armor interrupts the fight and one side of the infantry has to fall back or get mowed down. Now the second way these 2 fights intertwine is when those infantry classes that can fight back do fight back with rocket launchers or stingers, but really this isn't the 2 fights intertwining, because when an infantry class uses these launchers, he is no longer taking part in the infantry battle in any way. And if the infantry battle comes his way, he's either going to get gunned down while he's shooting at vehicles, or he's going to have to abandon his efforts to shoot at vehicles altogether. And typically those launchers don't even get the kill. Their biggest accomplishment is almost always to either hold back or push back the enemy armor, and outside of that instance, and the reverse of it when armor is pushing back infantry, there isn't an actual fight involving both types of combat. And this is why Operation Locker and Operation Metro 24/7 servers are always so popular. Anytime you go into server browser in Battlefield 4, there are always several servers dedicated entirely to either one or both of those maps, and all those servers will be filled up with a fat queue waiting to join. This is because there is a wide section of the Battlefield fanbase that isn't interested in playing cat and mouse with vehicles, that isn't interested in spending the entire match hoping they don't run into an enemy vehicle that they can't beat unless they are running the engineer class with the right launcher equipped. Hardline is a game that is designed with those kinds of players in mind, the the ones who prefer infantry-based combat. And one of the big reasons I think many players do prefer infantry-based combat is because it takes a while to learn how to do well in most Battlefield 4 vehicles, learning the specific strategies and timing you need to use to properly wield a tank or helicopter and employ countermeasures correctly and knowing when to back off. Usually most Battlefield 4 vehicles require at least a crew of 2 to be utilized effectively, not only because you need a gunner but also because you need a repairman. And this learning curve isn't something that the more casual audience of gamers is interested in overcoming. And I believe that more casual audiences still constitute a majority of FPS gamers in general. And even hardcore gamers like myself still sometimes want something to casually mess around on, and Battlefield Hardline is trying to be that version of Battlefield. Much faster games compared to the marathon commitments you had in Battlefield 4, much faster waiting times in between matches. I think the whole currency system is designed with an eye towards casuals because it lets people get what they want when they want it, as opposed to having to put in a pretty hefty amount of playtime to reach certain unlocks and such. And I also knew that that was what this game had in mind, and I think it will accomplish what it's setting out to do, which is provide a more casual infantry-based Battlefield experience whose primary goal is to peel off a wider chunk of the COD audience. That much was obvious 6 months ago. Now, I was originally very unhappy about this because based on my experience with that first beta, I felt like they were basically taking vehicles out of the game completely because the cars and the helicopters were so easy to destroy. I mean, like half of an AR clip could disable and blow up one of the sports cars or cops cars, same with helicopters, and my impression was that vehicles were only going to be useful as speedy transports from point A to point B, basically as a clever way to decrease respawn times, right? To decrease the amount of time in between each fight. I felt like there was going to be very little actual vehicle gameplay, and that they were doing that to basically compress the skill gap and cater to casuals as much as possible, because like I was just talking about, vehicles generally have a steeper learning curve, higher skill gap, and higher reward ratio than infantry, and thus Battlefield would be just like every other game where you ran around and shot at people and got shot at. But and this goes back to Visceral actually using player feedback. The vehicles got an armor buff, and Hardline definitely does have very fast-paced and interesting vehicular combat, and I tried to really emphasize that in this montage. What Visceral has done is provided an experience that we haven't ever seen in past Battlefields. They've successfully meshed vehicular and infantry-based combat together. Because now the infantry can always go toe-to-toe with the vehicles. If a cop car rolls around into the fight, they don't have to scatter or try to avoid it. They can fight it. That's not how it was in Battlefield 4. Usually in Battlefield 4, when vehicles came into the fight, you had to run away. The cars have certain advantages, more armor, more speed, but also certain disadvantages. They're a much bigger target, and if they aren't moving fast enough, the window shot is the new headshot. The people in the car become sitting ducks, and that's essentially true for most of the vehicles. Even the helicopters are very susceptible to primary weapons fire or a well-placed noob tube, which will knock you out of the sky pretty easily. And it also means that light armored vehicles can do combat with one another in ways that weren't really prevalent in past Battlefields, because if you look at the light vehicles in Battlefield 4, for instance, they weren't consistently available for combat situations. You never got to experience those types of combat scenarios. The motorcycle, that Jeep with a mounted turret, the armored car, the transport heli, these vehicles could almost never be used in combat situations. They were only ever utilized as taxis, quick transports into battle, but they were almost never used for combat in any meaningful way unless someone was strapping them with C4 and turning them into a mobile improvised explosive device. Because not only did these light vehicles have to deal with the heavy vehicles that could shit on them very easily, right? I mean, Abrams or a light tank or even an Amtrak grenade launcher will absolutely decimate a motorcycle or even an armored car pretty easily, but they also had to deal with all the equipment and launchers designed to counter those heavy vehicles. SRAs, SMAs, anti-tank mines, C4. They had no countermeasures, so if a javelin locked onto a light vehicle, the light vehicle driver had no choice but to abandon the vehicle altogether. In past Battlefields, light vehicles have always been useless in combat scenarios because they get shit on by heavy vehicles and they get shit on by the stuff that is supposed to shit on those heavy vehicles. Not to mention light vehicles were still very susceptible to infantry gunfire in those past games as well. And because of all that, it was even rare that you got to see light vehicles fight against one another. Like in all the years I played Battlefield, I don't think I've ever gotten to have a Jeep on Jeep fight. I don't think I've ever seen a motorcycle chase where the two guys on the back of each motorcycle are trying to kill the other guy and the drivers are all swerving left and right and shit to throw off the respective bad guys' aim. I never got to chase down ground vehicles with the transport heli. I never got to utilize the armored car in any meaningful way. The most I ever did was drive it to briefly defend an MCOM or something and then one RPG and you have to abandon the motherfucker. But all of these things, which have never been available as an experience in any past Battlefield, are a staple of the Hardline experience, and they are very fun. Hardline is the first Battlefield where these light infantry vehicles actually get to play a role. It means that the vehicles and the infantry are all a part of the same battle and can each target one another, which is different from past Battlefields. So say you have a bunch of infantry and vehicles fighting one another at the same time in Battlefield 4, if one side wins the vehicle battle, they're going to pound into the infantry, but if one side wins the infantry battle, the infantry can all overwhelm the vehicles and the vehicles have to back off. And I don't think one of those experiences is necessarily better than the other, I just think they are very different. And I'm sure plenty of people will still prefer Battlefield 4, but I would argue that even those players who prefer the Battlefield formula may find a refreshing change of pace in Battlefield Hardline, because Hardline accomplishes what many games have failed to do, which is innovate and do something new. And again, it wouldn't be possible had they kept in a lot of what made Battlefield 4 so fun, primarily the majority of the vehicles in that game, because to have all those heavy vehicles, you also have to have the counters to the heavy vehicles, and between the heavy vehicle counters and the heavy vehicles themselves, there would be no room for light vehicles in any combat situation, and then this game really would be a carbon copy of Battlefield 4, which was of course a carbon copy of Battlefield 3 to begin with. Now, I know there are a lot of people who want 2143, Bad Company 3 and such. My best guess is that they are waiting until they can build the game exclusively for new gen to release those titles, and in the meantime they found a clever way to do something new and innovative even within the constraints of the old gen hardware, and I give them credit for that. And they really take advantage of the light vehicle's new prominent role in combat. They really make it work. They do a lot of cool, unique stuff with it. Hotwire, I would consider one of the most entertaining new game modes I've played in a long time in any game, because most games haven't even had a new game mode in a while. I mean, it's always been variants of TDM, Domination, King of the Hill, and CTF in almost every FPS for a long time. Hotwire is a genuinely new experience and a lot of fucking fun. You know, you have pretty brutal car chases where people from both cars are shooting noob tubes back and forth at each other and exchanging gunfire. You got whoop whoop, that's the sound of the police, blasting in the background, and the whole radio system is sick as fuck. It really does pump you up for battle. You finally catch up to the car and you all plow into each other. You know, you're hanging out the window, you take some shots so you fucking get back in the car and feel all safe and cozy in the passenger seat, and you can repair the car. And again, the whole car combat thing in general is a big part of what I love about this game, and also a big part of what was missing from the original beta, just because cars were so easy to take out. And you get pretty creative with the cars. You know, they have their own upgrades, you can give them better armor, countermeasures, you can also have certain kinds of anti-vehicle launcher spawn in the trunk. And what's really cool, what my squad was doing, is you can put ammo and health boxes on the trunk of the car, and they'll stay there, and so you can replenish your ammo and health while staying mobile and shit. And so we'd have the driver be the ammo guy and then one medic guy, but the medic guy would get the RPG out of the trunk because the mechanics already had noob tubes, and you roll around in your car fucking shit up. And there's a lot of neat shit like that. And there is still a skill gap, it's a smaller skill gap than Battlefield 4. I knew they were gonna have to do this. And I'm probably going to end up criticizing them in the long run for this, but for right now, that skill gap is still wider than any other FPS on the market right now. It comes down to things like, you know, hitting moving targets. Accuracy is going to play a big role in this game. Your ability to hit things at awkward angles from a fast-moving vehicle that you're in is going to play a big role in success in this game. Reaction times. There's still a lot of room and necessity for teamwork, both in the vehicles and also in a game mode like Heist. That's something I was worried about in that original beta as well, was, you know, that teamwork was out the door, because, you know, you could have the whole system which you can take the ammo and the health off of a teammate without having to communicate, and the vehicles didn't seem to leave much for coordinated efforts. But because of the tweaks they've made since the last beta, that is no longer the case. You know, Heist is really a game mode for the Locker Metro 24/7 players. That is a straight up clusterfuck. So far, I really like what they've done with map interactivity. I know there isn't as much destructibility, and that's probably something I will also go further in criticizing them for when I've had more time to play the game. But to their credit, they did do a lot of cool stuff with, you know, map interactivity. You know, they've done cool stuff with the bank robbery sequence. You know, you're blowing the vault in, blowing in the ceiling. You open the gate from the vault from behind bulletproof glass, and so, you know, you're trying to get the gate open, but you're on the other side of the gate, and the bad guys are keeping it locked from bulletproof glass. And the first time you try to shoot in there and realize it's bulletproof glass, you're like, oh god damn it. And then you escape like a badass on the zip line, which is kind of cheesy, but it's really fucking cool when there's bullets flying all around you and whizzing left and right, and you're taking a few bullets to your body, and you're getting wounded, but you're like, will I make it across the street? Game is good at making your heart pound. Basically, it's not the Battlefield experience everyone wants, but I do think they get the fun factor right, and I think they offer a lot more content and enjoyment for your $60 than other major FPS games. You know, maybe Halo might offer more content and enjoyment, but that game is still largely broken 3 months out from launch. And I'm sure I'll still end up playing Battlefield 4 sometimes while Hardline is out, just because, you know, I like fighting in tanks and Vipers and shit. I suspect they'll continue to support it because they are aware that there is a portion of the fan base that prefers that Battlefield 4 style of BF, and I don't blame anyone who does prefer Battlefield 4. But I'm not going to rebuke Hardline for doing something new and different when that's what I've wanted from every game for a while, and they've all failed to deliver. You know what I mean? So this is my present state of mind regarding Battlefield Hardline. I've gotten burnt out on Call of Duty and Destiny. I wouldn't be burnt out on Halo, but I still can't find a match. I mean, I can find a match alone. I can't find a match with friends. But, you know, you look at Call of Duty and Destiny, all those games boil down to is, you know, moving around the map and shooting at people and getting shot at. And that can be fun, but it gets old fast. Hardline is not a game about moving around the map and shooting at people and getting shot at. It has a much deeper experience than that. And I commend it for that, and I'm ultimately looking forward to playing it, because at the end of the day, I play video games to have fun, and they pulled off the fun factor at the end of the day. You know what I mean? The For the Win query of the day is, do you see yourself buying Hardline or sticking with Battlefield 4 until Star Wars Battlefront, or maybe even beyond Battlefront? Maybe you're not interested in Star Wars and you're going to wait till Battlefield 5, which they have announced is going to... They've announced that that's a thing. I can't remember if they said they're like working on it or something, but they've announced Battlefield 5 will exist. So we'll see what happens with that. In the meantime, thanks for watching. I know it was a long one. Please be sure to rate and share the video. This is Batman, signing out.
I got this bitch.